Hello and welcome again. I'm Father Jason Tyler, pastor at St. Joseph Catholic Church in Fayetteville, and I'm glad to be presenting again one of these videos. This is now the 8th in my series, I believe, on the Interregnum, what's happening between popes, as we've already laid Pope Francis to rest, and we're still in that official mourning period for him, with the Novemdial Masses happening each day in St. Peter's Basilica. But yet we've not yet begun the Conclave, which will start on Wednesday, May the 7th. And so I'm talking through different things about the process, what to expect, how to see everything in perspective. There's a lot of information out there, and my hope is not so much to give you a news report of what's happening, but to give some background, some analysis, something that might help in understanding the news that you're reading and that you're getting in various places. Because, frankly, I'm not in a position to be the reporter on the scene for what's happening. But I think what I can perhaps contribute is some of that perspective of the way leadership in the church often thinks, the reason for the various processes involved in mourning one pope and electing another. And so anyway, I thank you all for watching. Thank you for sticking with me through these various days. I'm a little bit late in recording this. I'm recording this Thursday morning, May the 1st. So happy feast of St. Joseph the Worker. I'm a little behind. I would have liked to have done this yesterday, but the day got away from me. I'm hoping we can still get this one out and published later on today. And then I may try to record another one tonight to kind of stay on track for that one a day. But at any rate, what I want to talk about today is the movie Conclave. That's getting a lot of discussion lately, as you might imagine. It's available on Prime Video, at least that's where I watched it. Probably you can find it in other places as well, but that happened to be the one where I could see it. It's of course a movie that came out last year in 2024, and I remember when I first saw it promoted, I was intrigued. I thought, well, this is interesting. They're going to make a movie about the process of electing a pope. I'll want to see that. Well, then as the movie came out, I heard about this weird ending that's involved, and I heard a few negative things, and I said, it wasn't that I was boycotting it, right? It wasn't that I was running a major campaign against it, but I lost all interest in it. I thought, gosh, do we have just another sort of Hollywood take on the life of the church without understanding the complexities and the depths of what's going on? So I did not make it a priority to see it. It went, through the theaters and out and onto streaming, and it wasn't a priority for me even to watch it on streaming for a while until, of course, Pope Francis died, and the movie gets a lot more attention again. And I had some questions about it from people with, just genuine curiosities in one sense of, one is how accurate is this? Two, what are my thoughts on it as a Catholic priest? And so I'll try to share what I can here. The first thing I'll say is, in watching the movie, I actually enjoyed it, most of it, more than I had expected to. Now, again, that's understanding. I had kind of a low bar going into it. So the fact that I got through it in one sitting without having to turn it off, maybe that means I enjoyed it more than I expected to in that sense. But beyond that, part of what I enjoyed is they got a lot of the mechanics, if you will, the process for how a pope is elected correct. The personalities, on the other hand, that's where I'll get into why that's more problematic. But the specifics of the cardinals gathered in the Sistine Chapel, but before they get into the Sistine Chapel, they have to check in at Domus Sanctae Martyr, the Vatican guest house. And I've never been inside that building. I've seen the outside of it. I know roughly where it is on the sort of Vatican property, but I've never been inside. But when I saw the pictures of it, or images of it in the movie, I thought, that looks like a lot of European, either simple hotels or European, sometimes even religious guest houses and things that I have been inside of. And so, especially for ones that are relatively newly built. The Domus was built, I believe, in the early 1990s. So it's just a little over 30 years old at this point. So by Vatican standards, that's like brand new. And so, again, I thought that those scenes looked, again, like what I could imagine that to be. Even the changes of vestments, they have the cardinals at times wearing their red choir vestments. They have them at times in the black, what's called a house cassock. It's black, solid black with the red buttons and the red piping. That, looked mostly accurate. Sometimes with the choir cassocks, they should have had a mosetta on maybe that they didn't, or something along those lines, or a rochet. But those are some really detaily things that, again, I didn't. If they were off, they weren't so off that it jumped out at me. Even when the cardinals were celebrating Mass a couple times, that was accurate, in terms of the Mass vestments, the miters, that sort of thing. Sometimes you see Hollywood depictions of the life of the church, and they're mixing it all up, right? They've got guys sitting around in a meeting wearing miters. Well, that doesn't happen. A bishop or a cardinal only wears a miter if he's celebrating Mass or concelebrating Mass or leading some liturgical service. Other things that they got right, even little scenes of the cardinals having to get into a van and go back and forth between the Sistine Chapel and the Domus, yeah, that's probably accurate because those are kind of on opposite sides of St. Peter's Basilica. Most of the cardinals are in their 70s or maybe their 60s, and so they're not walking that distance, and especially they're not walking that distance when they're not supposed to be seen by the world and not supposed to be interacting with the world. So the idea of them being shuttled back and forth, yeah, I'm fairly certain that's exactly what happens. The cardinals sitting in different language groups when they're sitting down to eat, very plausible, very plausible. It's easy to imagine that happening. And different cardinals having different perspectives, different thoughts on who the next pope should be, that's part of the human condition. The degree to which they have these differences, so that's where some of the problems can creep in. So, all right, having said what I thought was accurate, let's look at the things that I thought were off, in some cases very off. The first one, a major premise of the movie, and I'm going to give some spoilers here. This movie's been out a while. If you haven't seen it, yeah, I guess you can pause and watch this later if you want. But I figure anybody who really wants to see it and not have the ending ruined, you've probably done that already. So a major part of the plot is that they're just about to go into the Sistine Chapel, they're just about to start the process. A guy shows up and says, "Hey, the previous pope created me a cardinal in pectore, and I have this letter to prove it." Well, in pectore is a Latin term that literally means in the breast. And it, practically speaking, for a cardinal, what that means is, at various times in history, the pope creates a cardinal without naming him publicly. And this is usually because of some situation of persecution. There's a thought that things could go badly for this cardinal if he's known publicly, or things could go badly for the church in that local area. And in the movie, this in pectore cardinal was originally from Mexico, but was the Archbishop of Kabul, Afghanistan. And so, yeah, that's a place of a lot of unrest. Maybe that would be a spot to name an in pectore cardinal. I kind of doubt it in some ways, but, maybe. The difficulty, though, is not so much that a cardinal was named in pectore, which actually has not happened in a while. Francis did not name any cardinals in pectore. Benedict the 16th, I don't think, named any in pectore. John Paul II did. But the thing about an in pectore cardinal is, if the Pope does not reveal his name publicly before the Pope dies, that cardinal loses any ability to be a cardinal, to vote in the conclave, anything like that. So it's as though he never were a cardinal. And that's to prevent the kind of situation we have here, where somebody just shows up in the conclave and is like, "Hey, I've got this document that says I'm really a cardinal." No, that would be kind of chaotic. And so there can be no surprise in pectore cardinals showing up for a conclave. That's the first thing that's just, wow, that's wrong. Another thing that happens in the movie, it's a smaller thing, but it's something that I was a little surprised they got wrong, and that is they show a Mass at the beginning of the conclave, before the cardinals actually are in the Sistine Chapel, where the dean of the College of Cardinals is celebrating Mass with the other cardinals present. That's true, that happens, and that will happen on May 7th at 10 o'clock in the morning. The dean of the college will celebrate a Mass. But what the movie gets wrong is, it looks like it's just the cardinals in this Mass. There's nobody else there. But the actual Mass before the conclave begins is at 10. It's at 10 o'clock in the morning Rome time. That'll be 3 in the morning here. I will not be getting up early for that one. But it's open to the public. It will be in St. Peter's Basilica. You'll see a huge crowd there. In 2005, I was there. I was living in Rome, and so I went to the Mass that then Cardinal Ratzinger, who was Dean of the College of Cardinals, the Mass he celebrated before the opening of the Conclave that would go on to elect him as Pope Benedict XVI. There were several scenes in the movie where the Dean is shown walking around basically semi-public areas of the Vatican. So he's not walking through St. Peter's Square, but he is walking through an area where you can tell people are moving around, people that are regular workers in the Vatican. He should have been away from the world along with everyone else. The Dean doesn't get to just, mosey in and out of the kind of sequestered conclave area. And then we get into some of the character difficulties here. The Dean breaks the seal on the door of the previous pope. I talked in a previous video about how the pope's rooms get sealed off, and that goes back to several centuries past. Probably in the Middle Ages, there was more of a concern, even so than now, about potential fraud issues. Someone trying to circulate some document to say that it was from the now deceased pope, or perhaps issues around theft or sensitive information that might have been in the pope's apartment. So all that is sealed until a new pope is elected, and the new pope gets to break the seal and go in and see what needs to happen there. So the Dean breaks the seal on the Pope's door at one point because he's wanting to investigate one of his fellow cardinals. Now, as if that's bad enough, that, again, I have I kind of think that would not happen. I really have a, pretty strong faith in at least someone at the level of the Dean of the College of Cardinals, my goodness. Because if that's discovered, and it would be by the new Pope once he's elected, well, then that Dean who broke the seal, there's some significant penalties there. I don't know right offhand what those are, but let's just say I'm fairly certain he would no longer be Dean, at minimum, probably no longer a cardinal, possibly excommunicated. I don't know. Again, I don't know the specific penalties on that, but that's a bigger thing. An even bigger deal, though, is the same Dean of the College of Cardinals breaks the seal of confession. So he at one point is confronting this Nigerian religious sister over an incident where he saw that she got into had this very loud scene near one of the other cardinals, and so the Dean wants to know what's going on. And so he does two things with confession that are hard for me to believe. The first is when the sister's reluctant to speak to him, he says, "Hey, why don't you go to confession to me?" Any priest who's been around for a little while knows the challenge that this comes into. As a priest, I have to be the spiritual leader of the community, but I also have certain, you might say, professional responsibilities, legal responsibilities even to the community. And so if there's an issue of something I have to deal with in what's called the external forum, in the broader world that everyone else can see, I don't want to hear the confession of somebody who knows about that, because if I do, I have to then take that information and compartmentalize it and act as though I've never heard it. Now, again, most of the time that's easy because most confessions I actually do forget anyway. But in a situation like that, it would be very difficult to forget that. And in fact, what we see happening is he says, "Hey, sister, why don't you go to confession with me?" And then later we see him confronting the cardinal that she had the spat with. And essentially, he's using information that is extremely strongly implied in the movie that he learned in confession. He's using that to talk to this cardinal about why this cardinal should not be pope. Again, the seal of confession is such an ingrained absolute in the mind, certainly in my own mind and the mind of any priest I've ever come across. I mean, I know a lot of priests who, we have our faults, obviously, right? We're human beings. I know certainly gossip can be a temptation, certainly various forms of detraction, and there's all that humanity there. But I've never known a guy to even allude to something he heard in confession in that way. And that's independent of any political ideology or view of the church or whatever. So to have a cardinal who sets things up to where, hey, sister, why don't you come to me? Why don't you tell me this in confession? And then deliberately uses that, even at the idea of wanting to prevent a bad pope from coming into office. That is really, really hard to imagine. And I know they talk about this dean of the college having a crisis of faith or whatever. But in other respects, he is shown to be a very honorable man. At least I think that's the attempt that they're trying to show there. An honorable man who's having a crisis of faith. That of itself is somewhat believable. A character who had asked the Pope to resign from office, but the Pope said, no, I need you to stay here. That's believable. That I hear about that happening in real life, not because of a crisis of faith so much as it is like, hey, Holy Father, I'd like to retire. I'm 70 plus years old. And the Pope says, no, I need you to stay on. Supposedly, that's what happened with then Cardinal Ratzinger approaching Don Paul II in his role as prefect of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, that he had asked a time or two to be relieved of that and to retire, and the Pope said no. Again, I don't know if that's true, but it's a very plausible scenario. So it's plausible the dean in this movie could have asked the Pope to retire, and the Pope said no. It's plausible even that this dean could have had a crisis of faith. That's, again, it's part of humanity, and I can see that affecting a cardinal. Mother Teresa spoke about having a prolonged dark night of the soul where she had some spiritual difficulties, but yet the Lord still worked through her. So I'm not terribly bothered just by this idea of this dean having a crisis of faith. I am bothered by him so easily manipulating the sacrament of confession. That just really struck me. And again, that's striking me as a priest because it is so much of an important part of what I do. And so that stuck with me maybe on a level that it wouldn't with someone else. I don't know. All right, next thing. The other big thing I find, kind of wrong here, the overall depiction of the conclave as a merely political event. Now, we need to understand a couple of things. It's not, we talk about the Holy Spirit being involved. That doesn't mean the Holy Spirit is just whispering in every cardinal's ear, hey, this is the guy you need to elect. The Holy Spirit is going to work through human realities. It's also the case, Cardinal Ratzinger said this before he became Benedict XVI. We have to look at the Holy Spirit's role not as simply giving us always the best possible pope. We've had too many examples in history when obviously that did not happen. But we do look at the Holy Spirit's role as being involved and at least preventing things from going terribly, terribly wrong. And so Cardinal Sean O'Malley, retired Cardinal Archbishop of Boston, has spoken about the conclave experience as being somewhat like being on retreat, being a very prayerful time. Certainly there are conversations happening at the lunch table. There are conversations happening in those downtimes between votes when they're outside the Sistine Chapel, when they're back at the Domus. I don't doubt that at all. But to see this only as a political event is the opposite extreme. So the one extreme is to say, oh, they're not talking to each other at all and they're just waiting for the Spirit to whisper in their ears. No. But also the other extreme of like, these are just men of the world trying to find this next worldly leader. No, there's a better combination here that's not depicted well, I don't think, here. The other, and of course tied with that is, of all the different papabili, that's cardinals who seem to have a good shot at becoming pope. And I'm going to talk about this term papabili in a later video as well. You can imagine one or two having a scandal similar to one of them depicted here, right? So there's one cardinal that had supposedly fathered a child in the past. There's one who had a major financial situation, trying to bribe other cardinals to voting for him. There's, I don't even remember some of them now. I guess the dean with his kind of his crisis of faith or whatever. They all seem to have some scandal in a sense, except for what's supposed to be the bad guy, this Cardinal Tedesco, that they don't want to have elected. They don't really, go into any hidden scandal of him. They just portray him as being sort of, I guess, stuck in the past would be the way the movie would maybe see him. And maybe they try to show him a little bit being opportunistic when there's a terrorist attack that happens. But at any rate, the multiple scandals involved here, it's possible to imagine, again, cardinals are human beings. It's possible to imagine one papal contender having a similar scandal. It's possible to imagine more than one cardinal in the room having some kind of scandal. But the fact that almost everyone who's getting votes has some big skeleton in the closet, and then they portray the previous pope as kind of working behind the scenes, not to directly confront the situation, but to sort of manipulate it so that things pop out later on or something. That's really hard to believe. And that's probably the biggest difficulty here, besides the confession stuff I mentioned earlier. Now, keeping in mind, of course, if they made a movie about what the conclave really looks like, what the real conversations are, it probably would not be exciting enough to sell many tickets. So keep that in mind. So bottom line is, it's not a movie I recommend if you want to get a peek into maybe what's happening in the minds of the cardinals going into the vote. It's a movie that could be helpful if you want to just see the exteriors, the externals of how some of the process works. I mean, even down to the way they cast their votes, declaring an oath, the way they count the votes, a lot of that's pretty accurate. But, again, the personality factors are a problem. Some of the particular movements are a problem. If you want to watch it, it's not sinful to do so. But do take it with a major grain of salt, especially as those personalities are concerned. Recognize it's definitely a work of fiction. If you're looking for a work of fiction about a papal election or the process of becoming pope, I might recommend an older movie. It goes back to the 1960s, called The Shoes of the Fisherman. Now, I don't know where you can get that on streaming. I was looking it up just now. I find a few different places you can rent it, including Prime and a couple of others, but I couldn't find any where it's like, hey, if you're already subscribed to this channel, you can get this for free. But I'm fairly certain it's got to be out there somewhere, or again, if you want to pay the $3.79 to rent it, it could be well worth your while. It goes back to the 60s. It's about a Ukrainian cardinal who becomes pope and goes on to sort of confront the communist world. And it's a major, interesting foreshadowing of the fact that we would, 10 years or so after this movie's made, we would have a Polish cardinal become pope and go on to confront the communist world and to help bring down the Iron Curtain in that way. So anyway, that's a great one to watch if you're looking for a movie about papal elections. Shoes of the Fisherman is broader than just the election, but it does tap into some of that. There have been some changes made to the election process since that movie was made, and I'm going to touch on some of those probably as we get closer to the conclave. But for now, again, apologies. I'm looking at almost 23 minutes I've gone on here, so this is much longer than my target time, but there was a lot I wanted to say here, and again, this is a response to various questions I've been getting, so I'm hoping this is helpful for you. I really do appreciate you watching. Spread the word. Let other people know. You can feel free to share these. Certainly subscribe, and again, we're trying to get one video out per day, at least until the conclave begins. So again, thank you for watching. Have a great day, and again, Happy Easter.